All right. Hello, marketers. This is the Funnel Lab. Welcome to Funnel Lab Fridays. I am your host, Doug Bell, CMO here at Calvermine. Nick Zongra, VP of Solutions Architecture and RevOps Jedi Master at
Yo, yo.
Calvermine. And Misha Salkander, Director of Customer Data Strategy at Calvermine, joining us from Brazil. Thank you, Misha and Nick, for being here today. We're going to talk about the core challenge for effective attribution, and that's data transformation. Welcome, Nick and Misha. We were just talking about theme songs for Funnel Lab Fridays. Got a lot of good ideas. I'm going to work on it and make sure we've got a new one coming up. All right.
Amazing.
Hey, so this is a special episode, and it's a special episode because the three of us spent an awful lot of time listening in on the market, or in your case, both of you guys, working directly with customers to make their lives easier and better. We're hearing a lot of folks showing up and they're sort of misunderstanding what's happening out there for them. And I'll set it up and we're going to get into some cool conversations about Attribution 1.0. We're going to talk about structured versus unstructured data. But let me set it up for you guys. Most companies that we work with come to us with an attribution need. That's fantastic. But in many cases, they have a sales and marketing performance data challenge at their core. So we want to spend time helping people sort of unpack and understand this. And we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson to some degree. It's going to help us sort of understand what happens. I'm a former CMO of Lean Data. Lean Data was sort of this classic organization that used installed packages in Salesforce. So I'm going to start things off with with you, Nick, to talk about this. So really, if there was an Attribution 1.0, it was organizations that check data into Salesforce. Sounds good, right? Really simple. Nick, why was this a problem? And then what caused Calvermine to rethink this whole concept?
Yeah, so I got to first off give a shout out to our ancestors in the attribution space, our predecessors. We wouldn't have this industry without them. So, you look at some of the legacy providers, Full Circle, Lean Data, like you mentioned, Visible to an extent, and as the cloud was becoming popular, all the eyeballs were in Salesforce. When I started marketing ops, everyone had two tools. They had their marketing automation system and the CRM. And so the logical place to build attribution was over there in the CRM. Fast forward, 6, 7, 8 years, and then terms like big data started popularizing. So big data was coined. This is a history lesson in the 1990s. And then even later, the concepts in like 98, NoSQL and application databases and unstructured data, semi-structured, all this. So at Calvermine, when we started a little over 8 years ago, we looked at what was the challenges with the current tooling. And we set out to reimagine it with the latest tools in the stack. And what was great at the time was you have Amazon and Google and Snowflake really leading the charge in a new breed of cloud databases that was particularly suited for big data attribution. And so what we realized is instead of trying to shoehorn all these millions and millions of records of marketing data, you got web visits, UTMs floating around, sales emails, product data, PLG is a thing now. All this data, gigabytes, terabytes in some cases. We kind of are in a place where we're picking the right tool for the job these days. We're able to do that, reimagine what attribution looks like. The same concepts, but in a much more scalable, modern architecture that, data science teams like. So that's the brief evolution.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring Misha in here because I think most folks understand this idea of structured versus unstructured data, and really Nick's done a nice job of laying out how the data sets that marketers depended on didn't just like become more complex, but the sourcing became more complex, right? So I think we get that, but before we get off this topic, Misha, I want to come back to you because there are some common problems inherent in CRM data, and we quite often, or you quite often, have to unwind these problems for clients. So tell us about that.
Yeah, when you say problems, I think there are limitations in very rigid structure. So if you say that objects can only be connected through certain keys, then as soon as a question gets more nuanced, for example, you move on from a question of what is my single touch, what is my campaign that drove a certain opportunity type of question. Yeah, this type of logic probably can be answered fairly straightforward in a CRM as long as you're willing for all the events exist in the CRM. As soon as you add a layer of complexity, let me also consider, say, web visits. Let me also consider emails. Or let me consider a situation in which I'm curious about a campaign, but only under certain conditions, right? Truly more data-driven, meaningful questions that will change the way you run your revenue operation. As soon as you ask these questions, a very rigid system like a CRM simply cannot handle it. And so I think it comes down to the nature of the questions. I think marketing has grown in its adoption of data, in the way it challenges data, the way it uses data. And so with this, I think there are a lot more and more organizations are facing kind of a limitation. Like, oh yeah, I want to report on more than exists in the CRM. I want to report on more nuanced questions than the CRM can handle.
Can one of you guys give me an example of one of those questions where, this ends up being a problem when you have these sort of CRM-centered solutions? And again, Nick, we're not trying to
top of mind, and it's basically echoing what Misha said. But a great example is clicking through an advertisement on a web visit, right? So Salesforce campaigns. Picture you're a campaign manager, and you go to a trade show, and you have a budget for that trade show. You pay a $50,000 sponsorship. And then you host the party, and you get the list from the party, and then you go back and you upload that list to the CRM. That's a very clean cut example. You met someone at the event. There's a clear investment, $50,000, and you have clear responses. People that stop by your booth are now in Salesforce attached to the campaign as campaign members. Whereas someone clicking through an ad, you may have Google dynamically serving hundreds of ads for you. As a campaign manager, there's two challenges there. One, it's the maintaining this database of all the campaigns. You're not going to go in and manually create hundreds of permutations of all these campaigns. It's not scalable for a market ops team. The second challenge is when a link is clicked in an ad, there's this long string we call UTM that it's basically a license plate that tells you what the campaign that generated that click. So same scalability issues is you have people clicking through the website, and now it's in cookies. They're browsing, they're bouncing off the site and coming back. You need infrastructure outside of the CRM to manage all that interaction, from anonymous down to, a conversion, a known visitor. So that whole web layer is missing in the CRM. And that's, these days, 80% of buying behavior is online before you even talk to sales. So that's a pretty critical piece.
I would say so. But there was a time, and Nick, you're taking us back to the 90s. There was a time when this was completely logical, right? This idea of these package solutions. So I think we get that piece. I want to spend a little time on sort of unstructured versus structured data. But before we jump into that piece real quick, what I want to do is to make sure that people are understanding that even with the cleanest data set, typically there's a transition that has to occur. And I think this is especially true the larger the organization is and the more history of data that you have. So I wouldn't mind if one of you guys would just sort of unpack what it looks like to take a data set that is not in great shape and transition it to a data set that is useful for an attribution platform.
Well, it's interesting that even a data set that is in the best conditions that sits within a CRM still might have its limitations. I'll give you an example. I want to have attribution, but I want to think of organizations more holistically. I want to have a buyer journey that really encompasses all members that I consider parts of the organization. Well, your CRM might tie you to conditions like, oh, let's only use primary op members, right? So like only if an individual is tied to the op will, let's say, attribution work. But marketers and revenue teams understand that, particularly a B2B buyer journey, it's much more dynamic, right? So you have to all of a sudden open up and be more flexible in terms of what are the events that can make it into the model. But to answer your question, fields in a CRM can be very difficult to work with. We do a lot of, for example, here at CloudMind, a lot of like normalizing of fields, job titles, account level fields, in order to be able to, in a BI layer or within a CloudMind UI, to answer questions like, for this group of people, for IT users, what has been my success of certain campaigns? It's very difficult to ask this question when you do not standardize title fields into buckets of IT, marketing, and so on and so forth. So it's a question of data granularity. And again, I come back to this comment of it's a matter of asking more nuanced, more meaningful, more useful questions.
Yeah, to kind of use some technical, and I think I'm using these terms correctly. There's the standardization that Misha's talking about, where you have 50 industries and you want a nice clean pie chart with 10 slices on it. You don't want to run out of colors on your pie chart. So you want to use CalberMind to standardize the data. And you might have some messy data and you've enriched your data with multiple data vendors over the years, but to report on it, you need that standardized data. So that's one component is, varied variety of values when you're segmenting. The other side, I would call normalization. So this is where I have a sales phone call might be logged in the system differently than a marketing email. So to do attribution, what we've came up with is a strategy to normalize the data, meaning we're going to take a grapefruit and a banana and make it an apple and an apple. So a little different, but one is like these values in the data and one is the schema of the data. And I think you really need both. And we run into all kinds of issues under the sun. I have this custom object and I need this normalized on my buyer journey. Or, I imported my trade show list, but I did it a week late. I need you to standardize my data and fix it with the right date stamps of when I don't want to use the system dates in Salesforce. Those are wrong. I need to fix some of the data and get the right date stamps. So there's a ton of things we're doing to fix the data often. And it's part of the, day-to-day challenge with attribution.
But to your comment, the larger the organization, the more this can happen, right? The more situations the organization might come across where somebody uploaded a list a week late, right? In an organization where only one individual uploads all the lists all the time, and they do this on Friday at 2 p.m., okay, it's just less likely to happen.
Man, Fridays are a good day for us. Everybody's attributing on Fridays.
Exactly. But you go to an organization that has it's a matter a bit of scale. And I think larger organizations understand, look, there's a lot of, yes, we try to create processes, but there are people behind the scenes and so there could be gaps, and having a system that can address these gaps could be very strong, because if it made it into the CRM in an erroneous way, that's probably, you're going to have to live with that.
The larger, the more channels. So,
and I just, sorry, Nick, to interrupt you, but I just want to say that let's get back to a history lesson, and I want to let folks know what happens when you don't do this, when you don't deal with this, which is you end up defaulting to a model where you only trust first and last touch. Ultimately, that's what you do. And so sort of my nightmare scenario for the industry at large is that folks misunderstand that they have a sales and marketing performance data normalization challenge. They go looking for a tool. They pick the wrong tool. They pick the wrong services approach. Sorry, I'm proselytizing, folks, but this is something I've seen way too many times. They spend all this money. They go, well, attribution doesn't work. Right. And so I just see this again and again and again and happening. And your default, and if you've done a self-build, I've done a few. If you do a self-build, you end up in the same place, right? You end up in this place where you put all this effort in, and because you haven't normalized, rationalized the data, you end up with a less useful model. Okay, I'm off the soapbox, folks. Sorry about it. I've been in the industry a really long time, really passionate about this piece, but I do want to make sure we get to this idea of structured versus unstructured data. And again, this is not a cheerleading session about CloudMind. This is a cheerleading session about large, complex organizations that have to balance these two things. So who wants to take this? Are you up, Nick? Do you want to talk about sort of the golden, if you will, the golden layer and how to think about this? Help us understand why this is important.
Yeah. So, as employee 3 at Calbermind, and we had to make some of these decisions like, should we go Google or Amazon? What database should we use? Is it NoSQL or SQL? We had a lot of decisions to talk through. And so when you think of big data, it's a spectrum. You have unstructured, completely unstructured, and this could be even different file types, video, sound, text, email snippets. So that's highly unstructured data. When you think of big data, like say a retail store deals with, there's so many different shapes and varieties that, you want a tool maybe like Hadoop or Cloudera to deal with that unstructured data. Then you have highly structured, rigid data like Salesforce. And this is an old school relational database. Everything has a primary key. It's all linked together. And the reason why NoSQL started to become popularized, you have when all the Web 2.0 apps were coming out, think you have like Uber, and I need to know where my car is on the map. There's a very particular real-time need for highly transactional, fast data. And that's where something like, a Mongo database or a Redis or, Couchbase, these are NoSQL databases that are for building applications. And APIs, by the way, when APIs send data, that's somewhere in the middle. We call that semi-structured data. So it's a blob of data, but all the data is labeled. Maybe it's like email address, and then you have a blob, hair color, eye color, right? Title, occupations, whatever. And as data scientists, we like the ability, and data engineers, we like the ability to consume the fire hose of data from an API, regardless of where it's coming from and the shape. So this is why when Calbermind set out, we said, well, unstructured data is out of scope. We don't really care about the content of a video or, like an LLM. We're not thinking that way, completely unstructured. And Salesforce is too rigid. So let's come up with a semi-structured approach. And by the way, folks like Google are awesome at building these clouds these days. So we ended up selecting Google. And what's great about the way I believe we're architected, and there's one or two other companies that think similarly about attribution, but we take all the semi-structured data from these APIs, and maybe you have email data from Marketo looks like this, and phone data from CallRail looks like this, whatever. It all comes in, and then we normalize it into a golden record, and we restructure it so that you're able to plug it into analytics and BI tools like Tableau. So think of like deconstructing it all, making sense of it, or arranging the Lego pieces. These ones are red, these ones are white, these ones are, and then assembling it into a nice usable format. So we're not unstructured, we're not rigid structured. It's just right in the middle, Goldilocks. And then we're going to take this and make our golden record on top. And I think that's the strategy that's emerging. That's the best of both worlds, because you have all this data fixing that we just described. When I ask the database for that pie chart, I want a clean pie chart. I don't want 50, 100 slices. I want that nice clean pie chart. So we want to hit a golden reporting layer that's normalized and standardized on top of this big mess of semi-structured data. And that's where I think, that's how I think we've been able to deal with some of the more complex customers.
Nick, are we making compromises here? In other words, are there things that maybe this structure would be less good at compared to others?
Yeah, I mean, kind of in the example I use, it's what tool do you want for the job? If I was building an app in Uber, I probably wouldn't use a structured database. Yeah. There's going to be a small lag when you're asking for the data, you're joining it up, you're querying it. Yeah. It's going to be infinitely more performant than, querying an Oracle database in the 60s, but it's not going to be that real time. The car on the map is moving and I can see my Uber driver. So that's the compromise. Like for example, we find that for reporting use cases, refreshing the data nightly is good enough. That's fast enough to make good decisions. And the reason we only do it nightly is because there's 75 steps in our data pipeline. And that's not an exaggeration. That thing takes 4 or 5 hours to run. So for really good quality analytics, I think you need to be patient and do that processing. And you sacrifice a little bit of the real time nature for, the quality and the trustedness of the data.
Yeah, I spent some time 2 days ago learning a great deal about media mix modeling. And even the B2C organizations don't need real-time data. You think about these massively complex models; they're not acting on those models in a 1 or 2 hour period. In other words, they're also in this spot where that lag is more than appropriate. Well, that's good stuff, folks. I think what I'd like to do is to just round things out today with some kind of quick tips on what customers or prospects should be thinking about. In other words, let's give them ways to go, yes, I'm in this bucket or I'm not in this bucket. Okay. So they can sort of understand whether or not this is a conversation that really helps them or hurts them. So Misha, I'm going to go to you. Are there customers who can live with that sort of simple is the wrong term. The customers who can live with, hey, I'm checking in a package to Salesforce. Are there businesses that'll be just fine with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can offer very good answers to very specific questions under very specific criteria. I think as soon as there is a sophistication in the types of questions that are born, then I think it might no longer be sufficient. But interestingly, similarly, the answer would be almost the same for somebody who decides to use unstructured data, because you have to have very specific questions that you set up a mechanism for that you can answer with unstructured data that would populate a very specific answer widget, whatever you want to call it. As soon as you change the nature of the question, as soon as it becomes more nuanced, you actually want to go back to some form of organized data in order to be able to ask a variant of the same question. I want to ask a similar, please.
Misha, can I maybe throw something at you? And this is the simple rubric I use, because I feel like quite often I'm explaining attribution for folks that never heard of it. And again, I've been around this industry for a while, so I'm sort of used to it. But when I talk about inherent complexity in our data, and then I have a discussion around why making sure that the data is normalized so that you can use it. When I start getting to the point, I'm like, look, you don't need attribution. I'm typically talking to a B2B customer who has a fairly small ACV, a fairly short sales cycle,
right,
and just not a ton of complexity, so that you're not going to make an error of spend judgment. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to misinvest, because really at the end of the day, this is what it's about, right? Mm-hmm. Am I going to invest well to drive growth, such that you can live with the last or first touch? Mm-hmm. And those are days. Like, it's like, do you have a 10-day sales cycle with 2 channels that are performing for you? And they exist. These companies exist. There's lots and lots and lots of them, right? Then you're fine. Yeah. But for everybody else, really, if you've got a multi-channel model, gosh, it's just not going to work for you. Nick, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to echo that. I think that the more your sales cycle looks like a B2C, and it's shorter, low ACV, and even for answering a question like, how do I generate more free trials? That could be something where you could use a last touch for, because it's a low commitment. They're not spending anything. You're not asking for their credit card. And so you can often make that decision in a single journey, in a single session. And so for a question like that, it's last touch. But you look at a lot of the customers we work with that maybe they have free trials, but ultimately, say you're selling to developers and you have a couple people creating accounts, free trials, but ultimately you need to get to the CTO to sign off on the big purchase. Yeah. So you're going to try to add up all these single touches and then put it into a big model ultimately. So that's where it breaks down, is when you're trying to answer, well, how did the CTO purchase? Well, it's actually all these little things that added up to get, the big deal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a great example, Nick. Thanks for that. And I just I think we've all felt that for the longest time, that organizations are, sorry for the bad metaphor, but they're driving blind, and they're driving blind because they have no way to associate sales and marketing performance data with revenue. And so I think there's been this huge pressure over the last couple of years as capital costs have gone up and marketing budgets have been cut. And the pressure valve, the release valve for marketers is attribution. But there's a cynicism about attribution. And so they're like, well, it doesn't work. And we have friends in the industry who talk about dark funnel. And like, I feel like that wave is at least gone. But then my fear is that folks are not understanding, again, this idea that really it's about getting that data in good shape. And then, having an application that can sort of manage and actually take you through those differences and changes that go on. So Nick, what were you going to say?
And hey, one key point is, as the sales cycle gets really long, and Doug, we're doing this with our ABM programs, you need leading indicators to measure as well besides attribution. So attribution is great when someone gets in your sales funnel. But if you say, we're going after these 100 target accounts and we're going to spend money on ads, then maybe you need a metric like how many of our target accounts are visiting our website. That's kind of, top of funnel, one click down. That's pre-attribution. So the point I wanted to make is, I'm 100% with you. I think for B2B, attribution is absolutely the best way. Multi-touch is the best way to prove marketing ROI. But it takes a while you don't have 6 months to wait around and say, hey, did they get in our funnel or not? It could take several conversations and months. So I'd encourage our users to think, how are you going to measure that as well?
Nick, we know attribution is the Trojan horse. Once you have attribution in place, the addiction begins, right? You start seeing engagement data. You're able to manage a multi-channel model intelligently instead of looking at these BI flat file layers and trying to understand what's going on. Exactly. It's incredibly addictive.
I guess the last thing I want to say, and I completely, what Nick just said resonated and had kind of mirrored what I mentioned earlier. If your data structure is set to answer a very specific question, let's say a set of attribution questions, what if all of a sudden you actually want to pivot away and ask questions that are, let's say, around leading indicators or around moment in the funnel, or actually not, or account related as opposed to campaign related? This is why we decided to actually find a middle ground of somewhat of a structured data set, because you can pivot your nature of questions. And that's why everyone's a caliber mind, attribution solution. Well, no, we're actually like a data engine at the core that allows you to have a toolkit of asking various types of marketing questions, marketing, sales, revenue questions. Attribution is one of these tools, but there are several others. But what enables them is this unified data set. And it is somewhat structured, right? So the inputs can be varied, but this kind of golden layer is something we stand behind because of this.
It's not as jargony for like SEO, and that's probably why it's not on our homepage, right, Doug? It's like, we're actually a data normalization company. That's really what we do.
Hey, folks, there's going to be an episode. We're going to talk about large language model optimization. It's starting to bubble up. It's getting sort of scary if you think about it. So I digress. Nick and Misha, it's always such a pleasure to have you on the show. There's always such a great conversation. I appreciate you guys being with us today.
All right. Happy Friday, everyone.
Happy Friday. Okay, that wraps up this episode of Funnel Lab Fridays. You're going to want to join us next week. We're going to be joined by Angela Hill of Chief Outsiders. We're going to do a rapid fire episode dedicated to the latest applications on the marketing front that are helping marketers accelerate the funnel. So if you've been wondering what's happening out here, this is going to be a fantastic episode. Folks, join us next week. In the meantime, thanks and have a happy Friday.